She arrived with 2 trunks, no connections, and no reputation anyone out here would recognize. Nathaniel Blackwood had built the most powerful ranch in Montana. Thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, more money than most men see in 3 lifetimes. And he was watching it slowly hollow out from the inside, one empty room at a time. He thought he needed a housekeeper. What walked through his door was something he had no category for, a woman who looked at everything he'd built and saw, with complete clarity, exactly what was missing. They told her to stay in the kitchen. She reorganized the kitchen, fixed the supply chain, saved the cattle, and then started in on the man himself. This is the story of what happens when the most self-sufficient woman in the room meets the most guarded man in the territory. And neither of them sees what's coming until it's already there. If this story finds you, hit like right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this has traveled. Stay until the end. You'll want to see how it lands. The wagon hit a rut in the road and Evelyn Hartwell grabbed the sideboard to keep from sliding off the seat. The driver, a heavy-set man named Court, who had spoken exactly 4 words to her since they left Billings, didn't bother slowing down. She didn't ask him to. She adjusted her grip and looked out at the land spreading away from both sides of the road. It was early October and the grass had gone gold and flat under the sky, which was the kind of blue that looked painted on, too clean to be real. The mountains sat in the distance like a wall someone had built and forgotten about. Everything was enormous out here. Everything made her feel like a very small thing moving through a very large country. She had known Montana would be different from Ohio. She hadn't known it would feel this indifferent to her existence. The letter from the agency had described Blackwood Ranch as one of the finest operations in the territory, belonging to Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood, a man of substantial means and impeccable reputation. She had read that sentence twice, standing in the kitchen of her sister's house in Columbus, and thought, substantial means. She wasn't interested in his means, she was interested in the job. The job was housekeeper, a real one, not the kind that dusted shelves and looked pretty. The agency had been specific. Blackwood Ranch employed over 30 men and ran thousands of head of cattle. It needed someone who could manage a household staff, coordinate supplies, keep a kitchen running for a crew that worked from before sunup to after sundown, and do it all without being told twice. The pay was $40 a month, which was 15 more than she'd made at the boarding house in Columbus. She'd packed 2 trunks and told her sister she'd write when she got settled. Her sister had said, "Evelyn, you don't know anyone out there." "I know," Evelyn had said. "That's part of the appeal." Now, bouncing along this rutted road with a man who didn't speak and mountains that didn't care, she felt the first thread of doubt work its way through her chest. She pressed it flat. Blackwood Ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and even at a distance, even before she could make out details, Evelyn understood that everything the agency letter had said about scale was an understatement. The main house was 2 stories, timber and stone, with a long porch running the full front of it. Behind and around the house spread barns, outbuildings, a bunkhouse, storage sheds, corrals, a small town's worth of structures, all of it surrounded by flat grazing land that reached the foothills. She could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the gold grass. Too many to count. It should have looked prosperous. Somehow it didn't. She couldn't name it right away. What was wrong? The structures were sound, the fences were intact, everything was functional. But there was something in the way it sat there, silent and gray, even in afternoon sun, that felt less like a working ranch and more like a place where people went to survive. Court pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and climbed down without a word. He dropped her smaller bag on the ground and started unhitching the horses. "My trunks," she said. "Someone will bring 'em." He didn't look at her. She picked up her bag and walked to the front door of the house. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. The door opened and a woman stood there. Mid-40s, heavy through the shoulders, gray hair pulled back from a face that had spent too many years being tired. She looked at Evelyn the way people look at something they were expecting but not particularly glad to see. "You're the one from Ohio," the woman said. "Evelyn Hartwell." "Yes." "I'm Clara. I've been doing the cooking since the last housekeeper left." She stepped back from the door. "Come in then, mister. Blackwood's out. He'll be in around 6. The inside of the house told Evelyn everything the outside had withheld. It was clean enough. Clara clearly kept things from going to ruin, but there was no order to it. The kitchen was large and had good equipment, but the shelves were arranged in a way that made no sense, with staples mixed in with specialty items and half the canned goods turned with the labels to the wall. The main room had furniture shoved against the walls like someone had moved it once and never moved it back. The fireplace had a layer of ash in the grate. Clara walked her through the house with the weary efficiency of someone who had been showing the same problems to the same invisible audience for a long time. "There's 6 of us who work inside," Clara said. "Me, 3 girls who do the cleaning and laundry, and 2 boys who do supply runs and odd jobs. We used to have a proper housekeeper, but she left in July. I've been doing both jobs since then, and I'll be honest with you, I'm tired." "I can see that," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her, surprised, like she'd expected something else. "There's 34 men in the bunkhouse. They eat in shifts, breakfast at 4:30, noon meal brought out to wherever they're working, supper at 6. The ranch has its own vegetable store, but we've been running low since August and nobody's ordered replacements." "What about meat?" "Cattle, obviously, but the slaughter schedule hasn't been managed well and we've had gaps." Evelyn was writing things down in the small notebook she kept in her pocket. "Who handles ordering?" "Mr. Blackwood, mostly, or he did. Lately he's been leaving it to Frank Delaney, that's his foreman. And Frank's good with cattle, but he doesn't think about the kitchen." "Has anyone told Mr. Blackwood about the supply problem?" Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Telling Mr. Blackwood things is not as simple as it sounds." Evelyn wrote that down, too. Nathaniel Blackwood came in at 5 minutes past 6. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch, the door, voices in the hall. Clara had told her to wait in the main room, so she waited. She stood near the window with her hands at her sides and her notebook in her coat pocket. He came through the doorway and stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the chest, with the kind of physical presence that came from actual work rather than the studied manner of wealthy men in cities. His face was weathered and sharp-featured, and he had the eyes of a man who spent a lot of time looking at distances. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years past. There was dried mud on his boots and a cut on his left hand that hadn't been cleaned properly. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I'm Evelyn Hartwell. The agency sent me." "I know who you are." He pulled off his hat and dropped it on a chair. "You're smaller than I expected." "I hear that often." He walked to the sideboard and poured himself water from the pitcher there. "You came from Ohio?" "Yes." "You have ranch experience?" "No." He turned and looked at her. "The agency letter said you had household management experience." "I do. 7 years at the Whitmore boarding house in Columbus. Before that, 3 years managing my father's household after my mother died. We had 12 regular tenants at the boarding house and a staff of 4. I handled everything from supplies to staffing to conflict resolution." "This isn't a boarding house." "No," she said. "It's larger and more complicated, which is why the agency recommended me." He was quiet for a moment, studying her in a way that wasn't unkind exactly, but was thorough. She met his eyes and waited. "Claire's going to show you where you're sleeping," he said. "I'll want to talk with you tomorrow morning, after I've seen the books." "I'd like to see the books, too." He paused. "I beg your pardon?" "The household accounts, purchasing records, supply logs, staff schedules. I'd like to see them before our meeting tomorrow, if that's possible. It would help me come with a useful assessment rather than just general observations." He stared at her. "Unless you'd prefer I wait," she said. He picked up his hat from the chair. "Clara will get you the household ledger. The rest of the ranch accounts are mine." "Of course." He walked toward the hall, then stopped. "Miss Hartwell." "Yes?" "I run a working ranch, not a boarding house. The people here are busy and the work is hard and nobody has time to explain everything twice. I need someone who can figure things out on her own." "Then we're in agreement," she said. He looked at her for another second. Then he left. That night, Evelyn sat at the small desk in her room, which was adequate with a window that faced the barn, and went through the household ledger by lamplight. It was worse than she'd thought. The household had been running on habit since the previous housekeeper left. Purchases were being made by whoever happened to need something, without coordination, which meant they were simultaneously overstocked on some items and dangerously short on others. There were duplicate orders for things like salt and lamp oil, and a complete absence of orders for things like dried beans and cornmeal. The staff's schedule was a handwritten list on a single piece of paper with no indication of who was supposed to be working when, which meant Clara had probably been deciding it by memory every morning for 3 months. The meat situation was worse than Clara had let on. Looking at the slaughter records, Evelyn could see a gap coming at the end of the month. A week, maybe 10 days, where there wouldn't be enough to feed the crew unless something was done now. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finally set down her pen, the lamp was burning low, and the ranch outside her window had gone completely quiet. She looked at the list she'd made. It was long. She was used to long lists. She set it on the desk, changed into her nightclothes, and lay down on the narrow bed. Through the window, the Montana sky was enormous and full of stars. She thought about what Clara had said. Telling Mr. Blackwood things is not as simple as it sounds. She'd figure that out later. First, she needed to understand what she was actually dealing with. So, breakfast for the ranch crew ran on a precise schedule that had nothing to do with Evelyn's preferences. Clara was up at 4 o'clock and had biscuits in the oven by 4:15. Evelyn was there at 4, hands washed, ready to work. Clara looked at her with something between surprise and suspicion. "You don't have to be here this early," Clara said. "I know," Evelyn said. "What do you need?" For a moment, Clara didn't say anything. Then she pointed at the large cast-iron pan on the hook by the stove. "Eggs, if you know how to do them." "I know how to do eggs." She did them. She also sliced the side meat and laid the biscuits out when they came from the oven and helped Clara carry the serving dishes to the long table in the room off the kitchen where the hands ate in shifts. The first shift was at 4:30. The men who'd been on overnight watch. They came in with cold on them and sat down heavily. Evelyn stayed out of the way and watched. The men were, mostly, too tired to notice her. But she noticed them. She paid attention to who sat with whom, who ate quickly and who lingered, who was visibly worn down and who had energy left. It was what she'd always done in any new household. Read the room before she tried to change it. There was one man who sat apart from the others, at the end of the table, eating fast. He looked about 20, with a narrow face and a bruise along his jaw that had gone yellow at the edges. A few days old. He didn't talk to anyone, and nobody talked to him. After the first shift cleared out and the second was settling in, Evelyn found Clara refilling the coffee. "Who's the young one?" she asked quietly. "Sits at the end." Clara glanced over. "That's Billy Crane. He's been here about a month. Frank Delaney doesn't like him much." "Why not?" "Because Billy makes mistakes and Frank doesn't have patience." Clara set the coffee pot down. "Why are you asking?" "No reason, just learning faces." Her meeting with Nathaniel was at 8 o'clock, in the small office off the main room. He was there when she came in, seated behind a desk that was covered in papers organized in a way that suggested a system she didn't understand yet. She sat across from him and put her notebook on her knee. "You reviewed the ledger," he said. "I did." "And?" She told him. She didn't soften it and she didn't dramatize it. She laid out the supply problem, the scheduling problem, the meat gap at the end of the month, and the kitchen organization issue. She told him what would need to happen to fix each one and gave him approximate costs. He listened without interrupting. She appreciated that. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The previous housekeeper had been here 4 years. She didn't raise these issues. She may not have seen them, or she may have raised them and not been heard." He looked at her. "Is that an accusation?" "It's a possibility. I don't know enough yet to say which." He picked up a pencil and tapped it against the desk twice. "The meat situation? You're saying we have maybe 10 days before we run short." "Closer to 8, based on the slaughter records." Frank should have caught that. Frank is managing cattle, not the kitchen. They're connected, but he may not be looking at the kitchen side of the numbers. Nathaniel set the pencil down. "What do you need to fix it?" "Authority to place orders directly, without waiting for approval on each one, up to a set amount. Say $25. Anything above that, I'll bring to you." That's a significant amount of trust for someone who's been here 12 hours. Yes, she said. It is. You can set it lower if you'd prefer to move more slowly, but the meat problem won't wait. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. $15, he said. Anything above that, you come to me. All right? And I want a weekly accounting. Everything spent, everything ordered. I was going to do that regardless. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but something in his expression shifted. All right, Miss Hartwell, let's see how the first week goes. The first week was not smooth. She hadn't expected smooth. She'd expected resistance, confusion, territorial protectiveness, and general human stubbornness. She got all four. The kitchen staff, Clara and the three younger women, whose names were Dot, Ruth, and Alma, were cautious around her. Dot was openly skeptical. She was 23, efficient, and had been running the laundry and helping Clara in the kitchen since July. And she had the manner of someone who'd been doing a job she wasn't hired to do and wasn't going to be talked around easily. We've had a system, Dot told her on the second day, when Evelyn started moving things on the kitchen shelves. I can see that, Evelyn said. I'm not changing everything, just the things that are making more work than they need to. Clara set up those shelves. I know. Clara's been working twice as hard as she should with the tools she has. I'm trying to make her life easier, not criticize her. Dot thought about that. Where does the flour go? Here, closer to the baking station. Cornmeal beside it. Salt, sugar, baking powder right above. Everything you need in one reach. Dot looked at the new arrangement for a moment. That's actually sensible. I have my moments. The organization took 3 days. By the end of it, Clara had stopped sighing every time she came into the kitchen. The supply order was harder. Evelyn had to deal with the town merchant in Billings through Court, who made the weekly supply run, and Court had a habit of substituting items he thought were equivalent when the specific thing wasn't available. She went with him on Thursday. He didn't like it. I've been doing this run for 4 years, he said, on the road to town. I know. I'm not questioning your driving. Seems like you're questioning something. I want to build a relationship with the merchant directly, so when I need something specific, he knows why it matters. Court was quiet for a while. Then he said, Mr. Blackwood never sent the old housekeeper to town. Mr. Blackwood hired me to solve problems. This is a problem. Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, her name was Mrs. Grover, the old housekeeper. She was here 4 years and she cried when she left. Evelyn looked at him. Why did she leave? Court kept his eyes on the road. She got lonely, I think. There's not a lot here for a woman who wants company. Evelyn turned back to look at the road ahead. I'm not here for company. What are you here for? She thought about it honestly. The work, she said. Just the work. The merchant's name was Aldous Webb, and he was the kind of small-town businessman who had strong opinions about everything and a tendency to express them at length. He told Evelyn twice that he didn't usually deal with housekeepers directly. You do now, she said pleasantly, and handed him her order list. He read through it. His eyebrows went up at the quantity of dried beans. This is a lot of legumes. I'm building a winter store. The ranch has been operating order to order, and I'd like to have a month's backup on essentials. That's going to be expensive. I've been authorized to spend up to $120 on this order. She'd gotten Nathaniel to approve it the previous evening, in a conversation that had been shorter than she expected. He'd looked at her list, asked 2 questions, and said yes. Webb looked at the list again. He looked at her. You know what you're doing, he said, and it wasn't quite a compliment, but it was the closest thing she'd gotten. I'm learning, she said. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was running better. Not perfectly. She had a running list of things that still needed fixing, but the morning shifts were smoother, the meals were more consistent, and Clara had stopped looking quite so exhausted by noon. Evelyn reported to Nathaniel on Friday evening. She went over everything she'd spent, everything she'd ordered, and what was still outstanding. He listened and read through the accounting she handed him and asked 2 specific questions about the meat order. You moved the slaughter schedule, he said, by 5 days, to close the gap at the end of the month. That affects Frank's rotation. I know. I talked to Frank about it on Wednesday. He looked up from the papers. You talked to Frank? Yes. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed when I showed him the numbers. Something crossed Nathaniel's face that she couldn't quite read. He looked back at the papers. All right. She gathered her notes and stood. One more thing. What? Billy Crane. Nathaniel looked up again. Frank is running him too hard and not explaining what he's doing wrong. The boy's making mistakes because nobody's taught him, not because he's careless. If Frank keeps managing him this way, he's going to leave, and then Frank's going to have to find someone new and spend a month getting them up to speed. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Billy's not your responsibility. No, but household morale is, and the way Frank treats him affects how the other men behave. She paused. It's your ranch, Mr. Blackwood. You can tell me to mind my own business. I'm considering it. Fair enough. She moved toward the door. Miss Hartwell. She stopped. I'll talk to Frank about Billy. She nodded once. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. Mom. She was almost asleep when she heard the sound from outside. A low, rhythmic banging, like something hitting wood in the wind. She lay still and listened. The wind was up. It happened at night out here, she was learning, but this was different from the general settling and swaying of a building in a breeze. She got up and looked out the window. The barn door on the far side of the yard was loose and swinging in the wind. Each time it swung open and the interior was lit by moonlight, she could see horses moving restlessly inside. If that door went fully open, they'd bolt. She didn't wait. She pulled on her coat and boots over her nightclothes and went out into the cold, crossing the yard at a half run. The wind hit her like a wall. She reached the barn door and grabbed it against the next gust. It took both arms to hold it. She didn't have the angle to latch it from where she was standing. Hold it there. She startled. A man came around the side of the barn, dark shape resolving into Nathaniel Blackwood. In his coat, no hat, clearly also roused from sleep. He took the door from her without ceremony and held it steady while she found the latch and dropped it into place. They stood there for a moment in the wind, both breathing hard from the cold. How did you see it? He said. I couldn't sleep. I heard it banging. He looked at her, at the coat over her nightgown, the unlaced boots. You should have gotten one of the hands. There wasn't time. He looked at the door, then back at her. The wind pulled at his hair. The horses would have gotten out, she said. Not defensively, just as a fact. I know. He looked at the barn for another moment, then at the yard. Are you cold? Yes. Go back inside. She went. At the door of the house, she stopped and looked back. He was still standing in the yard, looking at the barn, not moving. She went in. Lying back down on her narrow bed, the cold still on her from the wind, she thought about his face in the dark. Not the expression, exactly. That had been hard to read. But the fact that he'd been there at all. That he'd heard it too, from wherever he slept, and come out without waking anyone else. That was a man who didn't sleep easily in his own house. She'd known people like that. People who lay awake listening for the things that might go wrong. She understood it better than she wanted to. Outside the window, the wind kept going, but the barn door held. The barn door held through the rest of that night, and the 2 nights after it, but Evelyn didn't sleep much in any of them. Not from worry. She'd stopped losing sleep over things she couldn't control years ago, or tried to, but because her mind kept running lists. Things to fix, things to ask, things to watch. She'd learned early in her life that the first month in any new place was the month that decided everything. You could come in loud and restructure and demand, and some people would fall in line and others would dig in against you. And by the end of it, you'd have a household that obeyed you and resented you in equal measure. Or you could come in quiet and watch and let people show you who they were before you started trying to change them. The second way was slower. It was also the only one that lasted. So she watched. She watched Clara in the mornings, the way she moved around the kitchen with an efficiency that had been worn into her bones over years, compensating without thinking for a space that wasn't set up right. Clara never complained. She just worked harder than she needed to, every single day, because nobody had ever sat down and thought about how to make the work easier. It made Evelyn tired just to see it. She watched Dot, who was sharp and proud and hid how much she was paying attention behind a carefully maintained air of not caring. Dot noticed everything. She just didn't want anyone to know she noticed. She watched Frank Delaney, the foreman, who came into the kitchen sometimes for coffee in the mid-morning and sat at the corner of the long table like a man who owned the room. He was competent. She could see that in the way the other hands deferred to him, in the organized rhythm of the cattle operation. But he had a short fuse and a habit of solving problems with his voice rather than his head, and it showed in the tension that ran through the bunkhouse on the days he was in a bad mood. She watched Billy Crane, who kept making small mistakes and flinching slightly every time Frank raised his voice in his direction, and who was slowly, visibly, losing confidence in himself. And she watched Nathaniel Blackwood. He was harder to read than the others. He moved through his own ranch with a kind of remote authority, present everywhere, intimate with nothing. The hands respected him. Some of them seemed to genuinely like him. But there was a distance he kept, even from the men who'd worked for him for years, that struck her as something more than reserve. It was the distance of a man who'd decided that closeness was expensive and he couldn't afford it anymore. She didn't know what had cost him that much. She didn't ask. That wasn't her business. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she filed it away because it told her things about how the ranch ran and why it ran the way it did. In the second week, she tackled the staff schedule. She sat down with Clara one evening after supper was cleared and spread the old scheduling sheet between them on the kitchen table. It was a single page of handwriting that had been amended so many times, the original assignments were barely legible under layers of crossed-out names and added notes. "Walk me through how this works," Evelyn said. Clara looked at the sheet like she was seeing it with fresh eyes. "It doesn't, really. I keep most of it in my head." "That's a lot to carry." "It is." Clara leaned back in her chair. "When Mrs. Grover was here, she had a proper schedule, weekly, posted on the board by the kitchen door. But after she left, it just kind of fell apart." "What was Mrs. Grover like?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Organized. Fair. She'd been doing it so long she made it look easy." A pause. "She got tired, though. I could see it coming months before she left. There's nobody to talk to out here, not really. Not about things that matter." "Did she and Mr. Blackwood get along?" "Well enough. He's not difficult exactly. He just doesn't—" Clara stopped, seemed to search for the right word. "He doesn't notice things. Not about people. He notices if a fence is down or a cow is sick. People, he's slower with." Evelyn looked at the schedule sheet. "All right, here's what I'm thinking." She'd written a new schedule out already, on a clean page. She walked Clara through it, fixed days and times for each staff member, with overlap on the heavy days and coverage worked out for the days when Court did the supply run, and two of the cleaning girls went with him to handle the laundry at the commercial wash in town. Clara read through it twice. Alma's going to say Thursday is bad for her. She has something on Thursday afternoons. "What does she have?" Clara lowered her voice slightly, though they were alone. "She's been going to see a man in town. It's been going on about 2 months. She doesn't talk about it." "Then I'll put her on Friday instead and give Dot the Thursday coverage. Will Dot mind?" "Dot minds everything. Then she does it anyway." "I can work with that?" Clara looked at her. Something in her expression had shifted over the past 2 weeks. The wariness hadn't gone entirely, but it had loosened. "You're different from Mrs. Grover," she said. "How so?" "She was organized, but she was gentle about it. Clara considered, "You're direct. Does that bother you?" "Not so far." Clara folded her hands on the table. "Ask me again in a month." Oh, the schedule went up on the board by the kitchen door on Monday morning. Dot looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Evelyn. "Thursday's bad for me," Dot said. Evelyn looked at her. "I put you on Thursday specifically because Clara said it was bad for Alma and good for you." Dot blinked. "Oh." A pause. "All right then." Alma saw the Friday assignment and didn't say a word, but she looked at Evelyn once with an expression that was almost gratitude, and then looked away quickly, like she hadn't meant to show it. Ruth, the third girl, was 17 and so quiet Evelyn sometimes forgot she was in the room. She did her work perfectly and without complaint and disappeared when it was done. Evelyn was still trying to figure her out. The weekly schedule created an immediate improvement in the kitchen. The mornings stopped feeling like organized chaos and started feeling like not smoothness, nothing out here was smooth, but like people who knew what they were supposed to be doing. Fewer things fell through. Fewer things had to be redone. Clara started singing sometimes while she cooked. Old songs, barely audible, under her breath. Evelyn didn't mention it. She just listened and was glad. The harder problem was Frank Delaney. She'd known since the first week that she and Frank were going to have to find an arrangement. He was the foreman, which meant he had real authority over the ranch operations, and those operations touched the household at a dozen points. Through the slaughter schedule, through supply demands, through the work rotations that determined how many men were in camp at any given time and what they needed to eat. Frank's view of the household was simple. It existed to support the ranch crew, and it should do that without getting in his way. He'd tolerated Mrs. Grover because she'd understood her place, which in Frank's view was firmly below the operation level. He didn't know yet what to make of Evelyn, but he was working on forming an opinion, and she could see from the way he watched her that it wasn't trending positive. The confrontation, when it came, was about the Thursday midday meal. Frank had changed the work rotation without telling her, which meant a crew of 15 men came back to the main building at noon on Thursday, expecting a hot meal when she'd planned for them to be working the south pasture. She had food for 8. She stretched it as far as she could. She was good at that, better than most. But there wasn't enough, and 7 men ended up with half portions and hard looks. Frank came into the kitchen afterward and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his jaw set. "That was a poor showing," he said. She was washing a pan. She set it down and turned around. "Was? Because I didn't know the rotation had changed. I don't report rotation changes to the kitchen. You need to start." Frank's eyes went hard. He was a big man, somewhere past 50, with a face made of angles and a voice that was used to ending conversations. "I beg your pardon. I'm not asking you to run your decisions by me," she said. "I'm asking you to let me know when something changes that affects how many men I'm feeding and when. That's basic coordination." Mrs. Grover never required coordination. Mrs. Grover is gone, and 7 men just had half a meal because of a gap in communication that didn't need to exist. She kept her voice even. She wasn't going to win this by getting louder than Frank Delaney. Nobody won anything by getting louder than Frank Delaney. "If you let me know about rotation changes by the evening before, I can adjust. If you can't do it the evening before, morning of is fine. I just need something." Frank was quiet. His jaw was still set, but something behind his eyes was working through it. "It won't always be possible," he said finally. "Cattle don't care about meal schedules." "I know, I'm not asking for always. I'm asking for when you can." Another silence. Then he put his hat back on his head. "I'll tell whoever's riding out to pass word." "Thank you." He left. It wasn't warm, and it wasn't resolved in any deep sense, but it was functional, and functional was what she needed right now. Dot had been in the kitchen through the whole exchange, very quietly doing something near the stove that probably didn't need doing. After Frank left, she said without looking up, "Nobody's ever talked to him like that." "Like what?" "Like it was just a practical problem." Evelyn picked the pan back up. "It is just a practical problem." Dot thought about that. "He respects practical," she said. "He just doesn't expect it from—" She stopped. "From a woman," Evelyn said. "From someone new," Dot said carefully. Evelyn looked at her. Dot's mouth was doing something that was almost a smile. "Fair enough," Evelyn said. Just see. The Billy Crane situation resolved itself partly and badly before Nathaniel got around to talking to Frank about it. She came out of the supply shed on a Wednesday afternoon and heard Frank's voice from behind the smaller barn, raised, hard-edged, the way it got when he'd moved past impatience into something colder. She stopped. "Not going to say it again. You check every latch before you leave a pen. Every one. I don't care if you checked it twice already, you check it again. Because if I have to spend half a morning chasing cattle because you couldn't take 20 extra seconds, I will put you on fence repair for the rest of the month. And I mean every fence, from the north line to the creek. Are we clear?" A pause. Then Billy's voice, quieter. Yes, sir. I don't hear conviction in that. Yes, sir. Louder. Still not quite enough. Get out of my sight. Evelyn was still standing by the supply shed when Billy came around the corner of the barn. He nearly walked into her. He pulled up short and looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been hoping not to be seen by anyone. She didn't say anything for a moment. Let him settle. You hungry? She said. He blinked. Ma'am? It's 3 o'clock. There's leftover cornbread from lunch. Come inside if you want some. He stood there, clearly not sure if this was a kindness or a trap. I should get back to... Frank told you to get out of his sight. You're out of it. Come eat something. He followed her inside, uncertain, and sat at the end of the kitchen table. She put cornbread in front of him and a cup of coffee and went back to what she'd been doing. After a while, he said, I checked the latch. I know I did. She looked up. Do you check it last thing before you walk away? Or do you check it and then do something else before you leave? He thought about it, genuinely thought, which she appreciated. Sometimes the second one. There's your answer then. Check it last, right before your foot moves away from the gate. After that, it's done. He turned the cornbread in his hands. Frank thinks I'm useless. Frank thinks everyone's useless until they prove otherwise. It's not personal. Feels personal. Most things do. She came and refilled his coffee without being asked. You're still here after a month. That means something. Frank doesn't keep people he's completely given up on. Billy was quiet. He ate the cornbread in 3 bites and drank half the coffee and then looked at his hands. Where are you from? She asked. Nebraska. My pa had a farm. It went under 2 years ago. So you're learning cattle after a lifetime of crops? Yes, ma'am. Then stop being surprised that you're making mistakes. You're learning a new language. That takes time. He looked at her for the first time with something other than wariness. Mrs. Grover used to give me cornbread too, he said, when things were bad. Evelyn hadn't known that. Mrs. Grover sounds like she had good instincts. She did. He stood and picked up the cup to bring it to the wash basin. She used to say the kitchen was the one place on the ranch where a person could just be a person. Evelyn looked at him. She wasn't wrong. She reported the Billy situation to Nathaniel that same evening. She did it efficiently, without editorializing, laying out what she'd observed and what she thought the risk was. He's close to quitting, she said. Not because he's lazy, because he's been underwater since he got here and nobody's helped him find his footing. Nathaniel was behind his desk. He'd been going over cattle ledgers when she knocked, and he'd pushed them aside with the slight impatience of a man who valued his own time and wasn't yet fully sure hers was worth interrupting his. You talked to him, Nathaniel said. Yes. What did you tell him? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Frank's hard on the new ones, always has been. Most of them get through it. Some of them leave first. That's true. He turned a pencil in his hand. I'll have a word with Frank. I'm not asking you to undercut Frank's authority. Just some acknowledgement that Billy's trying, from someone above Frank. It doesn't have to be much. You want me to compliment a hand for checking a latch. I want you to make sure he's still here in a month. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. He had a way of doing that, holding a look longer than was comfortable, like he was making sure he'd actually heard you before he decided what to do about it. You've been here 2 weeks, and you're already managing my staff for me. I'm trying not to overstep. You're definitely overstepping. Yes, she said, but I'm right about Billy. The silence between them stretched for a few seconds. Then he said, Is there anything else? She handed him the weekly accounting. He read through it, asked 2 questions, signed off on a pending order. Good night, Miss Hartwell, he said. She went to the door. Mr. Blackwood. What? The cut on your hand from when you arrived. It's not healing right. You should have someone look at it. He looked down at his left hand like he'd forgotten it existed. The cut had been bandaged, but poorly, and she could see from across the room that the skin around it had gone red. It's fine, he said. It isn't. She came back to the desk, took the small kit she'd started carrying from her pocket, and put it on the desk in front of him. Clean it tonight and put the salve on. Change the wrapping every 2 days. He stared at the kit. This is outside your job description. You need your hands to run a ranch. She moved toward the door again. Good night. She found out the following week from Clara that Nathaniel had started talking to Billy Crane in the evenings. Not at length, just a few words here and there, passing in the yard. Billy had started standing a little straighter. Clara told her this in a way that was carefully not giving Evelyn credit for it, as though she was simply reporting an observation. Evelyn said, "Good," and kept chopping onions. Clara said, "You're not going to say you told him to do that?" "I suggested it. He decided." She pushed the onions to the side of the board. "Those are two different things." Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between approval and something harder to name. "Mrs. Grover used to say the best housekeepers run the house without anyone knowing they're running it." "She was right about that too," Evelyn said. The third week brought rain. 3 days of it, steady and cold, that kept most of the crew close to the buildings and turned the yard into mud and made everyone irritable. The kitchen ran almost continuously because men who couldn't work outside came in for coffee and warmth and took up table space and needed feeding at odd hours. Evelyn adjusted. She kept a pot of soup on the stove from morning to night, set out bread and cold meat so men could help themselves without needing service, and organized the comings and goings so the kitchen didn't become a bottleneck. It wasn't elegant. There was mud tracked in constantly, and she spent a full day managing a dispute between two hands who'd gotten into it over a card game and then refused to share a table, which meant she was seating people like a dining room manager at a hotel. But it worked. The kitchen didn't break down. On the third day of rain, Nathaniel came in for coffee at mid-morning. He looked around the kitchen, the soup pot, the laid-out bread, the two cowboys who were eating at one end while Ruth quietly swept mud away from the back door. And then he looked at Evelyn. "This wasn't like this before," he said. "Before the rain or before I arrived?" "Both, I suppose." She handed him a cup. "It's not complicated. People need to eat and get warm. You clear a path for them to do it, and they take care of the rest." He looked at the room again. He said, and drank his coffee. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but she was learning his vocabulary. From Nathaniel Blackwood meant something that surprised him had turned out to be right. She took it. The fourth week, she made a mistake. She'd been reordering the supply rotation, staggering the orders so they didn't all land at once, which had been causing a storage problem, and she miscalculated the timing on the flour order. It came in 4 days late. 4 days wasn't a catastrophe, but it meant Clara had to stretch what was left, and the biscuits for 2 mornings were smaller than usual, and a man named Hector, who was vocal about his opinions, said something at breakfast that was just loud enough for her to hear from the kitchen doorway. "New housekeeper's got fancy ideas about ordering. Shame she can't count." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Every person at the table either looked at her or very carefully did not look at her. She went back into the kitchen. Clara was watching her. "You gonna let that sit?" "For now." "Hector's all mouth. He's been complaining about something since I've known him." "I know." Evelyn put the flour canister back on the shelf. "He's not wrong, though. I miscalculated the timing." "You gonna tell Mr. Blackwood?" "I already did, last night, before Hector said anything." Clara blinked. "You told him you made a mistake before anyone noticed?" "He needs accurate information to trust my assessments. If I hide the bad ones, the good ones don't mean anything." She started on the midday prep. "Hand me the salt, would you?" Clara handed her the salt without speaking. A moment passed. "Mrs. Grover never admitted to mistakes," Clara said finally. "Mrs. Grover lasted 4 years," Evelyn said. "Maybe she should have." It was a harder thing to say than she made it sound, and she knew it even as she said it. She didn't know why Mrs. Grover had managed things the way she had, and she wasn't in a position to judge a woman she'd never met. But the principle was the one she'd built her whole professional life on. If you couldn't be honest about what went wrong, nobody could trust you when you said something went right. That evening, Nathaniel said nothing about the flour. He reviewed the accounting, asked his usual questions, and then just as she was leaving said, "The staggered ordering schedule is still the right approach. Work out the timing on the rest of the rotation." "I will," she said. She went back to her room and sat at the small desk and wrote out the revised schedule. It took an hour. When she was done, it was late and the ranch was quiet and the wind was up again outside her window. But tonight it sounded less like a warning and more like weather. She put the pencil down and looked out at the dark yard and the barn and the mountains beyond everything, invisible now but present, enormous in the dark. 4 weeks. She'd been here 4 weeks. The kitchen was running, the staff had settled, the supply chain was better. Billy Crane was still here. It wasn't fixed. There was still a long list of things that needed doing. There would probably always be a long list of things that needed doing. That was the nature of a place this size, and she was starting to understand that. But it was better than it had been. She turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark and thought about what Clara had said, that the kitchen was the one place on the ranch where a person could just be a person. Mrs. Grover had said that, actually. Billy had passed it on. She wondered what it said about a place that the kitchen was the only room in it with any warmth. She was going to have to work on that. The town of Granger sat 12 miles east of Blackwood Ranch, and Evelyn had been there exactly twice. Once with Cord on the supply run, once alone on a Saturday when Nathaniel had told her she could take the small wagon if she needed personal errands. She hadn't needed errands particularly, but she'd needed an hour away from the ranch, which was a different kind of need and one she wasn't going to explain to anyone. Granger was the kind of town that existed because the land around it required it. A feed store, a dry goods merchant, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, 2 saloons, a church, and enough houses along the main street to call it a town rather than a camp. The people there knew who Nathaniel Blackwood was, the way people in small places know the names of the mountains visible from their windows, as a fact of geography, large and permanent and not entirely personal. They were slower to know who Evelyn was. That changed sometime around the 5th week. She'd gone in with Court for the regular supply run, and while Court loaded the wagon, she went into the dry goods store for a few household items she preferred to select herself. The woman behind the counter, 50s, sharp eyes, the kind of face that held opinions the way a reservoir holds water, quiet and full, looked at her with recognition. "You're the one out at Blackwood Ranch," the woman said. "Evelyn Hartwell, yes." "Margaret Coles." She didn't offer her hand, but she leaned forward slightly on the counter. "We've heard about you." Evelyn set her list on the counter. "Good things, I hope." "Interesting things." Margaret began pulling items without looking at the list, which told Evelyn she'd memorized what the ranch regularly ordered. "People are curious about a woman in your position. My position. Running the house for a man like Nathaniel Blackwood. Unmarried. No family connection to the territory." Margaret said it without malice, but without softness either, the way a person states facts they find notable. "It's unusual." "I was hired by an agency to do a job," Evelyn said. "That's the whole of it." "Of course." Margaret stacked a bolt of muslin on the counter. "He's had housekeepers before. None of them lasted past a year." "I've heard." "Mrs. Grover was the longest. She was good, but she was lonely." Margaret looked at her steadily. "You don't seem like the lonely type." "I like my own company." "That'll help." She started writing up the order. "You should know that people will talk. They already are. A young woman out there alone with 30-some men, and one of the most eligible." She paused, seeming to reconsider the word. "One of the most prominent men in the county. People make stories." "People can make whatever stories they like," Evelyn said. "I have work to do." Margaret made a sound that might have been approval. "Fair enough. You'll want to know, though, that not all the stories are kind." Evelyn looked at her. "What kind are they?" "The kind that wonder why Nathaniel Blackwood would hire someone with no ranch background when there are capable women in this territory who've worked livestock their whole lives." Margaret kept her eyes on the order sheet. "And the kind that wonder what else she might be offering, since she's clearly not offering experience." The store was quiet around them. Evelyn heard Cord outside, the creak of the wagon. "I see," she said. "I'm telling you so. You're not surprised," Margaret said. "Not to hurt you." "I understand." Evelyn took a breath. "And what do you think, Mrs. Coles?" Margaret looked up then, looked at her for a long moment. "I think a woman who goes to town alone to handle her own errands, instead of sending a man to do it, Probably knows what she's about. That's what I think. She tore the order sheet and handed Evelyn her copy. Come back Thursday if you need the bolt goods. I'll have them in by then. She didn't tell Nathaniel about the conversation in town. Not because she was hiding it, she'd have told him if he'd asked, but because it wasn't his problem to solve, and making it his problem would have been the wrong move. If she went to him every time someone in Granger had a sideways opinion, she'd spend the rest of her time here in a defensive crouch, and that wasn't how she intended to live. But she thought about it. On the drive back to the ranch, while Court talked about the weather coming in from the north, she turned it over in her mind. The stories people made. What she was offering, since she was clearly not offering experience. She'd been in places that talked about her before. The boarding house in Columbus had been run by a widow named Mrs. Whitmore, who had told Evelyn on her first day that a young unmarried woman in a position of authority over male tenants would be noticed and commented upon, and the best she could do was be so competent and so above reproach that there was nothing interesting to say. It had worked, mostly, but it had required a particular kind of constant, quiet vigilance that was exhausting in ways she'd never fully admitted to anyone. She'd thought, out here, far from Columbus, it might be different. It wasn't different. It was just a different version of the same thing. She looked out at the November prairie and the sky beginning to stack clouds in the northwest, and she thought about what Margaret Coles had actually said, that she didn't seem like the lonely type, that liking her own company would help. Margaret wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. Evelyn liked her own company fine. What she was less sure about, if she was honest in the way she only was with herself in moments like this, bouncing along an empty road in a wagon with no particular destination she needed to pretend toward. What she was less sure about was whether she'd chosen solitude or whether solitude had, at some point, simply chosen her, and she'd made her peace with it. It was a question she set aside. There was too much to do. The storm came in the second week of November. She'd seen it building for 2 days before it hit. The sky going wrong colors in the evenings, the wind shifting from its usual northwest to something more directly north and colder, the cattle restless in their pastures in that particular way they got when they knew what was coming before the men did. Frank Delaney had started pulling crews in early and checking the outbuildings, and even Hector had stopped complaining about meals long enough to focus on securing what needed securing. Nathaniel had ridden out on the morning of the 9th to survey the north pastures and hadn't come back by noon. Evelyn had watched the sky and calculated. She doubled the soup and tripled the bread. She sent word to Clara to bring in every bit of firewood from the outdoor store to the covered porch. Not some of it, all of it. Clara thought this was excessive and said so. Evelyn said she hoped it was excessive. Clara muttered and got the younger hands to help carry wood. Nathaniel came back at 2 in the afternoon, ahead of the storm by maybe 3 hours. His face, when he came through the kitchen door and pulled off his coat, had that particular flat look that meant he was managing information he didn't like. "How bad?" she said, handing him coffee without being asked. "Bad enough." He drank half the cup standing at the kitchen doorway. "Temperature's going to drop 20 degrees by nightfall. Frank's pulling the cattle in from the north pasture now, but we're going to lose time. The supply road from Billings will close if this hits the way it looks." "How long could it close?" 3 days, maybe a week if the drifting's bad." He looked at her. "How are we on food?" "Comfortably," she said. "I extended the stores 2 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated a hard winter. Montana in November seemed like a safe bet." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to tell Frank that if he has to pull men off the cattle work to help secure the outbuildings, I'll manage the cook rotation myself so Clara doesn't have to handle the kitchen alone." "You can do that?" "I spent 3 years cooking for 12 people in my father's house after my mother died," she said. "I can manage a kitchen crew for a few days." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right. Anything else?" "The water pump by the east barn. The one with the loose fitting. If it freezes tonight, we lose our closest water source. Someone should look at it before the temperature drops." He set down the coffee cup. "I'll send Billy." She nodded. He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Hartwell." "Yes?" "The firewood on the porch." in case we can't get to the outdoor store. He looked at the stacked wood visible through the kitchen window, then at her. Good thinking, he said. He didn't say it the way people say things to be polite. He said it the way he said anything, like it had been evaluated first and found accurate. Then he went. The storm hit at 5 o'clock. It didn't ease in. It arrived the way hard weather arrives in open country. All at once, a wall of wind and snow that turned the yard invisible in under an hour. By 6 o'clock, the bunkhouse was completely sealed in. The men inside, by a count, Evelyn had checked herself, and the main house was battened with lamps lit against the early dark. The kitchen ran hot and constant. Evelyn and Clara worked side by side without much talk. They'd reached the point where they moved around each other without needing to negotiate the space, which was its own kind of efficiency. Dot came in to help without being asked, which was not a thing Dot had ever done before, and Evelyn noted it and said nothing because saying something would have made Dot uncomfortable, and the kitchen needed Dot right now. At 7 o'clock, with supper served and cleared, Nathaniel came into the kitchen and sat down at the end of the long table. Not for food. He'd eaten standing up at some point, she'd noticed, but with his ledger books, as though the kitchen was where he'd decided to work tonight. She found this interesting, but didn't remark on it. He worked quietly. The women worked around him, cleaning up, resetting for the morning. After a while, Clara and Dot went to bed. Ruth had fallen asleep in a chair by the stove, wrapped in her coat. Evelyn left her there. The wind outside was extraordinary. It wasn't the sound of wind through structures. It was the sound of something uninterested in structures, something that simply wanted to move, and would do so whether the buildings were there or not. The house creaked and pressed back. "How long have you been doing this?" Nathaniel said. She looked up from the bread she was setting out to rise overnight. He hadn't looked up from his books. "Doing what?" "Running a household. My mother died when I was 16. I started then." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." He looked up at that. She wasn't being sharp about it. She said it the same way she said most things, as a fact. He seemed to understand that, because he didn't react as though she'd been. "I don't ask about people's histories," he said. "I found it's easier not to." "I know. I noticed that." He held her look for a second. "And what conclusions did you draw?" "That something in your own history made you decide that." She went back to the bread. "Which is your business, not mine." The wind pressed at the house. Ruth made a small sound in her sleep and resettled. "My wife died 6 years ago," Nathaniel said. Evelyn kept her hands on the bread. Didn't stop, didn't make a sound, just kept working, because stopping would have made it strange, and she didn't want it to be strange. "I'm sorry," she said. "She was sick for 2 years before that. It wasn't a surprise." He turned a page in the ledger without looking at it. "But it changes things. A person you've built everything around. When they're gone, you build the rest differently." "Differently how?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Without a lot of unnecessary, he seemed to search for the word. "Wait. You mean without attachment?" "I mean without expecting people to stay." She covered the bread dough with a cloth. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. He was looking at the ledger now, really looking at it, and she had the sense that he'd said more than he'd meant to and was regrouping. "That's a lonely way to run a ranch," she said. "It's efficient. It's also why your last 3 housekeepers left." He looked up sharply. "You don't invest in people," she said, "so they don't invest back, and eventually they go somewhere that feels like it wants them." She kept her voice level. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you what I see." The wind hit the house hard enough that the lamp on the table swayed. Ruth stirred again, but didn't wake. "Mrs. Grover," he said finally. "She tried to—" He stopped, started again. "She tried to make the house feel like a home. I didn't encourage it. I thought she was overstepping." "She probably was," Evelyn said, "but she was also right." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she didn't try to name. It was too unguarded, and she didn't want to label it and make him aware of it, or he'd put it away. "You're very direct," he said. "You said you needed someone who could figure things out on their own. Directness is part of that." "I didn't mean about me." I know. She picked up the lamp from the counter. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. He didn't say anything. She went to bed with the wind tearing at the eaves and a conversation sitting in her chest that she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. The storm lasted 2.5 days. On the first day, Evelyn ran the kitchen, managed the food rotation for 34 men who were essentially confined to the bunkhouse, and came to the main building in rotating groups, and kept account of the supplies with the obsessive precision of someone who'd done the math and knew exactly how much margin she had. The margin was adequate. She'd planned for adequate. On the second day, the supply road closed, as Nathaniel had predicted, and the temperature dropped to a point where going between the buildings required a rope guide because the visibility was near zero. 2 of the ranch hands, Court and a man named Seb, had been in town when the storm hit and couldn't get back. Everyone else was accounted for. The cattle were the bigger problem. Frank had gotten most of them in before the storm, but there were 100 head in the south pasture that hadn't been moved in time, and in weather like this, that meant potential loss. The kind of loss that, at the scale of Blackwood Ranch, translated to thousands of dollars and a season's worth of work. Evelyn knew because she'd seen the cattle ledgers. Not all of them. Those were Nathaniel's, but enough to understand the scale of what was at risk. On the afternoon of the second day, she went to Nathaniel's office. He was at his desk with Frank, both of them looking at a hand-drawn map of the south pasture and speaking in the low, urgent voices of men managing a problem with no good options. She knocked on the open door. They both looked up. "I have an idea," she said. "You don't have to take it." Frank's expression said clearly what he thought about the housekeeper having ideas about cattle management. But Nathaniel said, "Come in." She sat in the chair across from the desk and laid out what she'd been thinking. The south pasture cattle couldn't be reached safely through the storm. The risk to the men outweighed the potential save, and she understood that. But there was a natural windbreak at the eastern edge of the south pasture, a low ridge that she'd noticed on one of the days she'd ridden out with Clara to collect dried herbs from the kitchen garden. If the cattle had moved to that ridge, and cattle in storms tended toward shelter, instinctively, they were already partially protected. What they'd need once the storm broke was getting them moving fast, before the temperature had a chance to bottom out again in the second cold wave that the sky had been suggesting since morning. "You'd need men ready to ride the moment the weather clears enough," she said. "Not when it clears fully, the moment it clears enough. Every hour in that cold is cost." She also told them that she'd looked at the cook-fire schedule and could compress the kitchen rotation on the break morning so that she could free up 2 of the general hands, Hector and a man named Davis, who'd done cattle work before and were currently assigned to kitchen firewood duty. Frank was looking at her with an expression that was not quite the same as his usual one. Not warmer, exactly, but different. "The ridge," he said. "I know the one you're talking about." "Do the cattle know it?" "They should. We've grazed that section all fall." "Then they're probably there." Nathaniel had been watching her through all of this. He asked 2 questions. How sure was she about the second cold wave, and what the kitchen could run on if she pulled those 2 hands? She answered both. Then he looked at Frank. "She's right about the timing. We move the moment the wind drops below." He looked at her. "Below survivable," she said. "You know that threshold better than I do." Frank made a sound she'd never heard him make before. She realized after a moment that it was a short laugh. "Below survivable," he repeated. "All right." She stood. "One more thing. The men coming in from the cattle run when this breaks, they're going to be cold down to the bone. I want to know ahead of time so I can have hot food ready and the bathwater heated. Don't send them to the bunkhouse first." Nathaniel looked at her. "I'll make sure someone rides ahead." She went back to the kitchen. The storm broke on this morning of the third day. The wind dropped first. Suddenly, the way prairie storms sometimes ended, like something had turned off. The snow kept falling for another hour, lighter and lighter, and then the sky began to show blue in the northwest, and the temperature sat still for the first time in 2 days. Frank had 3 men on horses before the snow fully stopped. Nathaniel rode with them. Evelyn had the kitchen at full fire by the time they'd been gone an hour. She sent Ruth to the bunkhouse with word that any man not on the cattle run should be in the main building in 2 hours. She set Clara to making the largest pot of beans and salt pork she'd ever managed, had Dot cutting bread until there was a stack of it, and heated the largest bathing tub from the supply room and set it near the stove with 3 buckets of water already warming. They came back in the early afternoon, 6 riders, frost on their coats, and the color gone from their faces in that particular way that meant deep cold. 3 of the hands went almost directly to the tub, taking turns in the warm water without any of the usual male awkwardness about it. 2 of them sat at the table and ate without speaking for 15 minutes. Nathaniel came in last. He'd taken off his coat in the hall, and she could see that his hands were shaking slightly, though she thought he didn't know she'd noticed. She poured coffee and brought it to him at the end of the table, away from the others. "How many did you lose?" she said quietly. 14. He held the coffee cup in both hands. Given the conditions, it could have been 60. She sat down across from him. She'd never sat at the table with him before. She'd always been standing, always been on the working side of things. But he looked like a man who needed someone to sit down with him. "The ridge," he said. "Were they there?" "Most of them." He looked at the coffee. "How did you know?" "I didn't know. I made an educated guess based on what I've seen of the land and what I know about how animals behave in the cold. It was more than a guess." "Maybe." She folded her hands on the table. "I've been watching this ranch since I got here, not just the kitchen." He looked up at her then, not with the measuring look he usually gave her. Something more direct than that, something less defended. "Why?" "Because understanding the whole helps me do my part better." She paused. "And because it's interesting, all of it. The way a place like this works, the way it fits together. I find it interesting." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the kitchen moved, Clara refilling plates, Dot carrying out the empty bread baskets, the low talk of men warming up. Outside the window, the post-storm light was the particular clean white that comes after weather passes, the sky so clear it hurt. "You saved a significant amount of money today," he said. 14 head instead of 60. At current market rates, that's roughly. "I know what it is," she said. "I've seen your cattle ledger." He stopped, looked at her. "I haven't shown you my cattle ledger." "No, but you left it open on your desk the night you went to check the south barn last week, and I was in your office dropping off the household accounts." She watched him work through whether he was bothered by this. He seemed to decide he wasn't. "And? Your per-head returns are lower than they should be for the quality of cattle I've seen out there. I think you're underselling at Billings and should be looking at the railhead market at Miles City. If you wanted." Another long look. The kitchen sounds moved around them. Billy Crane was at the far end of the table, eating soup, and she noticed he'd automatically moved to hold the bench steady, while an older hand sat down heavily next to him. A small thing, barely visible, but a thing he hadn't been doing 6 weeks ago. "You're not a housekeeper," Nathaniel said. "I'm exactly a housekeeper," she said. "I just don't think the job has fixed edges." He was quiet for a long time, then, "All right." "All right what?" "All right, help me work out the logistics." He set down the coffee cup. "After you finished with the kitchen." "I've been waiting for you to say that for 2 months," she said, and she kept her face neutral when she said it, but she could tell from the way his expression shifted that he'd heard the edge of something in it. Not accusation, but honesty, and that he was sitting with it rather than deflecting. The town of Granger heard about the storm and about Blackwood Ranch within a week of the weather clearing. News moved in small territories the way it always had, by word of mouth, along supply roads, through the men who rode in for feed and went back with more than they'd come for. What they heard was that Blackwood had come through the storm better than expected, that the cattle losses were lower than any comparable operation in the county, and that things out at the ranch had been running differently lately. Some of them attributed it to Nathaniel's management. Some of them attributed it to Frank's cattle handling. A few of them, the ones who paid attention to the right details, attributed it to the woman from Ohio who'd arrived in October with 2 trunks and no particular credentials. Margaret Coles, at the dry goods counter, heard several versions of the story. She filed them all away and said nothing to anyone except once to her husband over supper. "That Hartwell woman is going to be out there a long time." Her husband said, "Why's that?" "Because she knows what she's doing," Margaret said, "and she doesn't need anyone to tell her." What? It was Frank who shifted first, and the shift was so quiet that Evelyn almost missed it. He started leaving word at the kitchen when the rotation changed. Not always, and not with any particular grace about it, but sometimes a note passed through whoever was coming in from outside, usually just a head count and a time. It wasn't what she'd asked for in their confrontation over the Thursday meal. That had been about advance notice, which he still didn't give consistently. But it was information, which was more than before. She didn't thank him for it. She just adjusted accordingly and didn't make anything of it, which she thought was probably the right move with Frank. He wasn't a man who wanted acknowledgement. He wanted competence meeting competence, and acknowledgement would have made it awkward. Billy had stopped flinching. She noticed it one morning, the way he came into the kitchen for coffee before the morning shift. No particular hurry in him, no hunched quality to his shoulders. He'd grown something in the past few weeks. Not confidence exactly. It was more like he'd stopped treating every moment as a potential mistake. He talked to the other hands now at meals, nothing extended, but the natural back and forth of men who'd decided someone was worth including. He told her once, filling his cup at the stove, that Frank had asked him to demonstrate the latch check procedure to one of the newer hands. "He asked you to teach someone else," she said. "Yeah." Billy looked at the coffee. "I figured maybe I wasn't useless after all." She didn't say "I told you so," because that wasn't the point. "How'd the teaching go?" "All right, I think. Felt strange being on the other side of it. It'll feel normal eventually." He nodded and went out. She watched him cross the yard from the kitchen window, tall and lean in the cold morning, walking with the particular ease of someone who'd found their footing in a new place. It was a small thing, but she'd been here long enough to know that on a ranch, small things were the whole of the work, and the whole of the work was everything. The morning after that conversation, Nathaniel stopped her in the hall outside the kitchen. He had papers in his hand. She could see they were figures of some kind, columns of numbers. "I've been looking at the Miles City rates," he said. "And?" Frank was right. "I've been leaving money on the table for 3 years. He held the papers out, not quite handing them to her, more showing her. "I want to run the calculations on what the longer haul costs, actual cost, including crew time and feed on the drive." She looked at the figures. "I can do that if you give me the numbers." "I know you can." He held her gaze. "I want to do it with you. 2 sets of eyes." She took the papers. "Tonight? After supper?" "Tonight," he said. He went back toward his office. She stood in the hall for a moment with the papers in her hand and the kitchen sounds coming from one direction and the cold from the front door coming from the other, and something in her chest settled into a quieter place than it had been in a long time. Not comfort, exactly. Something more complicated than comfort. More like the feeling of standing somewhere and realizing, unexpectedly, that you recognize it. They worked on the Miles City figures that first evening until the lamp burned low and Clara had long since gone to bed, and the only sounds in the house were the fire settling in the main room hearth and the occasional creak of wind against the north wall. Nathaniel had cleared a space at the kitchen table, the same long table where 30 men ate in shifts, now reduced to the 2 of them and a spread of papers that covered half its length. He worked with a pencil and moved through numbers the way a man moved through familiar country, quickly and without needing to look at his feet. She watched how he thought. He saw the large shapes first, total cost, total return, the net, and then moved to the details. She was the opposite. She came at problems from the edges inward, building from the specific to the whole. It made them faster together than either of them would have been alone. "Drive costs from here to Miles City," he said, "accounting for 3 days on the trail, crew wages, feed for the horses. Figure it at $60 per drive for a herd of this size. Add another 15 for contingency," she said. "Weather, a lame horse, whatever." He looked at her. "That's conservative." "That's accurate. You always want the real number, not the hopeful one." He wrote it down without arguing, which told her he agreed and didn't want to say so directly. She let that pass. The per-head return at Miles City, factoring the current market rate she'd pulled from the trade papers Nathaniel kept in his office. She'd asked to see them the previous week, and he'd handed them over without comment, which was its own kind of progress, was $11 higher than Billings. Across a full season's drive, the math came out to a difference that made Nathaniel put his pencil down and sit back in his chair. 3 years, he said. You didn't have the information laid out in front of you. I had Frank telling me for 2 years. Frank told you the conclusion. He didn't show you the arithmetic. She looked at the figures. People are more likely to move when they can see the steps. He was quiet. He picked the pencil back up and turned it in his hand the way he did when he was thinking. You do that deliberately, he said. Show the steps. It's how I'd want to be persuaded. You don't seem like someone who's easy to persuade. I'm not, she said, but I'm persuadable if you give me something real to work with. She pulled the paper toward herself and added a column she'd been building in her head. First drive to Miles City should be smaller. Test the logistics before you commit the full operation. Say 200 head. Frank won't like that. He'll want to go full scale. Frank will do what you tell him. Frank does what Frank thinks is right and then tells me after. She looked up. That's a problem. It's been a problem for 11 years, Nathaniel said, and Frank's still the best foreman in the county, so I've learned to manage around it. Managing around a problem and solving it aren't the same thing. No, but sometimes managing around it is the realistic choice. He looked at her steadily. You understand the difference. She did. She also understood that he was telling her something about how he made decisions, not defensively, but as information. The way she'd been direct with him, he was being direct back, in his own less forthcoming way. 200 head first run, she said. If the logistics work, full scale in the spring. He nodded. I'll talk to Frank. They gathered the papers and he held the lamp while she stacked them in the order she'd used to present them. Outside, the night was the cold, clear quiet of post-storm Montana, and the stars were out in the number that still startled her, coming from a city where you could see maybe 30 of them at once. You said you started running your father's household at 16, he said. She hadn't expected him to come back to that. Yes. How long until you left Ohio? 7 years. When my brother was old enough to manage without me. She set the last paper on the stack. Then I went to the boarding house in Columbus. What did your father think about that? He thought I should have married by then and wasn't sure what to make of a daughter who hadn't. She said it without bitterness because it had been a long time ago and she'd spent the bitterness already. He wasn't a bad man. He just had a particular idea of what a woman's life should look like. And you had a different idea. I had a different life, she said. The idea followed from that. He looked at the lamp. The light made his face look older, the lines in it deeper. My wife had her own ideas about things, he said. She was not easy, but she was right more often than she was wrong. Evelyn waited. When he didn't continue, she said, What was her name? Catherine. He said it like he hadn't said it in a while. She grew up in Virginia. She hated Montana winters for the first 3 years, and then one day she stopped hating them, and I never knew what changed. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe she just decided. He looked at her. Maybe. He took the lamp and went to his office. She went to her room and lay awake for a while, not because the conversation troubled her, but because it sat in her chest in a way she needed to settle before sleep would come. December arrived, and with it the particular rhythm of a ranch in deep winter. The days shorter, the work concentrated and intense, the evenings long. The crew contracted around the necessary jobs, cattle, maintenance, firewood, water. Everything non-essential waited for spring. Evelyn used the slower pace to do the things she hadn't had time for in the first frantic months. She went through the household accounts going back 4 years and built a picture of where money had been spent, where it had been wasted, where there were patterns that pointed to structural problems rather than one-off mistakes. She reorganized the storage cellar, which had been a source of ongoing losses because things got buried and forgotten and spoiled. She sat down with each of the kitchen staff individually and asked them what they needed to do their jobs better, which nobody had apparently ever done, based on their expressions. Ruth, who was still the quietest of them, said she needed a sharper paring knife and better light by the wash basin. Evelyn got her both within the week. Dot said she needed Frank's laundry boys to stop sending blankets in with saddle grease on them because it ruined the other laundry. I'll talk to Frank, Evelyn said. Dot looked at her with the expression she'd been slowly developing over the past months, something between skepticism and a grudging acknowledgement that Evelyn was usually good for her word. Clara said she needed someone to teach Ruth to cook because Clara wasn't getting younger and she needed someone who could take the breakfast shift so she didn't have to be up at 4 every morning. Can Ruth cook? Evelyn asked. I have no idea. But she's smart and careful and she follows instruction. That's what matters. Teach her, Evelyn said. I'll adjust the schedule. The conversation with Frank about the laundry was, predictably, not warm. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who'd been told his crew was doing something wrong and wasn't sure whether to be defensive or reasonable. I don't control what state the blankets are in when they come in, he said. I know, but you control who handles them before they come in. If someone could shake them out and leave the worst ones for spot treatment before they go in the pile, it would save 2 hours of work on laundry day. That's not a cowboy's job. It's a 5-minute job, she said. It saves Dot 2 hours. The math favors it. He stood there for a moment. I'll mention it, he said, in the tone of a man who was not going to mention it. She let it go. Some things you pushed, and some things you let find their own level. The laundry situation was real, but not critical, and she'd already used up more of Frank's goodwill in the past month than she was comfortable with. The Miles City conversation was coming. Nathaniel had said he'd talk to Frank about the spring drive, and that was going to require Frank to admit that he'd been right for 2 years and ignored, which wasn't going to make him pleasant for a week, and she needed some room in the account before that happened. Nathaniel told Frank about Miles City on a Tuesday in early December. Evelyn wasn't there for it, but she knew it had happened because Frank came into the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon, which he never did, and stood in the middle of the room and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She was making a list. She looked up and waited. He told me you put the Miles City case together, Frank said. I put the arithmetic together. The idea came from you. He said it was your arithmetic that moved him. It was accurate arithmetic. That's what moved him. Frank looked at her for another moment. His expression was the most complicated she'd ever seen on him. Something she might have called gratitude if she'd thought Frank was the kind of man who experienced gratitude as a visible emotion, which she wasn't sure about. I've been trying to get him to Miles City for 2 years, Frank said. I know, you were right. Why'd he listen to you? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I showed him the steps, and because I came in from outside with no stake in the argument. Sometimes a new voice carries farther than a right one. Frank was quiet. Then, the laundry blankets, he said. I'll have whoever's last off night watch shake them out before they bring them in. She kept her face completely neutral. Thank you, Frank. He left. She sat for a moment looking at her list and thinking about the peculiar architecture of trust. How it built in ways you couldn't always predict, through small things done consistently and large things done once, and the occasional moment where something shifted without being pushed. She hadn't persuaded Frank of anything directly. She'd just shown up and done the work and let the work speak. And at some point, Frank had decided the work was worth respecting, and from there the rest had followed. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But it was real. Christmas came to Blackwood Ranch the way it came to most working places in the territory. Without much ceremony, but with a slight easing of the daily pace, a better meal than usual, and a bottle of whiskey that Nathaniel put on the bunkhouse table Christmas Eve with no comment other than telling Frank to make sure nobody was drinking when they should be on watch. Evelyn made a proper dinner. She hadn't planned to. She'd been thinking of it as a regular evening. But Clara came to her 2 weeks out and said, quietly but with unusual firmness, that the men would appreciate something special, that they were a long way from their families, and a good meal was the closest thing to a decent Christmas most of them would get. So she made a proper dinner. Roast beef from a steer they'd had to put down anyway after it injured a leg, mashed potatoes with real butter she'd been saving, 3 pies from the dried apple store, and corn pudding that Clara insisted on and turned out to be remarkable. They fed everyone in 2 sittings, which was more organized than any previous large meal, and the kitchen staff ate last, all 5 of them at the long table together. Nathaniel ate with the crew the first sitting and came into the kitchen after. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table where Evelyn and Clara and Dot and Ruth and Alma were sitting with their plates. "There's room," Evelyn said. He hesitated in the doorway the way he sometimes did. That slight pause that she'd learned was him deciding whether to let himself into something rather than uncertainty about the invitation. He sat down. He didn't say much, but he ate with them. And when Clara told a story about a Christmas 20 years ago, when the stovepipe had come down mid-dinner and filled the kitchen with smoke, and they'd had to eat outside in December, he laughed. A real one, not the polite, contained version she'd heard him use before, but something that reached his eyes and changed his whole face for a moment. She looked at her plate and didn't say anything, but she held it. The new year brought weather again, not as bad as November, but sustained. 2 weeks of temperatures that kept the crew close and the mornings brutal. It also brought something Evelyn hadn't anticipated, a letter. It came in the first supply run of January, mixed in with the ranch mail Court brought back from Granger's post office. It was addressed to her in her sister Margaret's handwriting. Margaret, who was 2 years younger and had been married for 4 years now, and had a daughter and a son in a house in Columbus, that she described in her last letter as full and loud and happy. Evelyn took the letter to her room and read it that evening. It was a long letter, full of news about the children and her husband Thomas and the neighbor's dispute and a dress she'd made. Near the end, Margaret wrote, "Evie, I think about you out there. I don't understand the choice you made, but I've decided I don't have to. I just want to know if you're all right. Are you lonely? I think I'd be lonely. Are the people there decent? Is the work what you thought it would be? Write and tell me something real, not just the weather and the schedule." Evelyn sat for a while with the letter in her lap and the lamp burning and the cold pressing at the window. She thought about Margaret's question. Was she lonely? She was, in some ways. She missed conversation that went somewhere, the kind she'd had occasionally in Columbus with people who'd read widely and thought carefully and weren't afraid of a disagreement. She missed her sister's kitchen, which was always too warm and too loud, and exactly the right kind of overwhelming. She missed the ease of a place that already knew her. But she also thought about the kitchen at Blackwood Ranch at 6 in the morning, the stove going and Clara singing under her breath, and Ruth learning to handle a pan with the focused care of someone who wanted to get it right. She thought about Frank passing word about rotation changes. She thought about Billy Crane holding a bench steady for an old hand. She thought about Nathaniel laughing in December at a story about a broken stovepipe. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Maggie, I am all right. The work is harder than I thought and better than I thought, which is usually how the real things go. The people are decent, most of them. I'm not lonely the way I thought I might be. I have a window that looks at mountains and a kitchen that I've made work, and sometimes in the evenings I feel like I've earned the right to be somewhere, which is not a feeling I've had before in the way I have it here. That may have to be enough of an answer for now. Kiss the children. Tell Thomas I hope the new year treats him better than the last." She sealed it and left it for Court's run. In February, Nathaniel started coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not every evening, not with any announced intention. He would appear in the doorway around 8, after supper was cleared and the staff had gone, and either stand there for a moment and leave, or come in and sit at the end of the table with something to read or work on. She didn't ask what had changed. She just made coffee when she heard him at the door and set it on the table and went back to whatever she was doing. The first time he sat for half an hour and left without much being said. The second time he stayed an hour and they talked about the spring drive logistics, which was a practical conversation, the kind they'd had before. The third time he said, out of nowhere while she was working through a supply schedule, "Do you miss Ohio?" She put down her pencil. "Parts of it." "Which parts?" "My sister, a few people from the boarding house, the way the city smelled in spring before the heat came in." She considered. "Not the boarding house itself. I was ready to be done with it." "Why?" "Because I'd made it as good as it could be, and then I was maintaining something instead of building something. That's a different kind of work. I'm not good at maintaining." He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at it here." "Here there's always something that needs building," she said. "It's not the same." He looked at his coffee. "Catherine said something like that once, that she needed to feel like she was still making something, even after the ranch was established. I didn't understand it then. Do you understand it now?" "Better?" He turned the cup in his hands. "She started a kitchen garden the last year she was well. Not for the ranch, just for her. Flowers and herbs and things that didn't have any practical use." He paused. "I pulled it up after she died. It seemed like, I don't know. It was hers. But you pulled it up. I wasn't ready for it to just sit there. He looked at the table. I've thought about that a lot. Whether she would have understood that. Would she? Probably. She understood most things about me, even the things I didn't. He said it without sentimentality, just as a true thing. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The area east of the kitchen garden, she said. The one that gets afternoon sun. He looked at her. What about it? In spring, if I wanted to put in some herbs, culinary, practical, would that be all right? He was very still for a second. Of course. I'd keep it simple, she said. Just the useful ones. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't push it, but something in the room had shifted in a way she couldn't precisely name. An opening, a small one, but real. Yeah. March came in cold and went out warm, the way Montana spring sometimes did. So sudden the ground looked surprised. The snow came off the north pastures fast, and the mud season hit hard. 3 weeks of it, every boot in the ranch tracked through the kitchen twice a day, and Dot threatening to resign every morning. Dot didn't resign. The spring preparations accelerated everything. The cattle count for the first Miles City drive was finalized at 180 head. Not 200, because a late illness had taken some of the strong ones Frank had earmarked, but close enough. Frank managed the drive preparation with the focused intensity he brought to large operations, and the crew felt it, the whole ranch running at a higher pitch than it had all winter. Evelyn ran the kitchen at the same higher pitch. She increased the cooking schedule, reorganized the supply rotation again for the drive period, when the camp crew would need packed provisions, and worked with Clara to build up a reserve in the cellar that would cover the 2 weeks Frank and most of the hands would be on the trail. Nathaniel was everywhere during this period. In the pens with Frank in the mornings, in his office with ledgers in the afternoons, out riding the herd in the evenings to assess the condition of what they were sending. He was tighter in conversation, more terse, and she understood that this was the concentration of a man who was gambling something real on a decision he'd been sitting on for 3 years. One evening in late March, 5 days before the drive was set to depart, he came into the kitchen later than usual. The staff was long gone. She was still up, going over the drive provisions list for the 3rd time, because she kept finding things to double-check. He sat down and didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. Frank thinks we're ready, he said. Frank's probably right. You think so? I think you've been ready for 3 years, and you finally organized the evidence. She looked at him. Are you worried? I'm always worried before a drive. Something always goes wrong that you didn't plan for. Yes, she said, and you handle it when it does. That's the part you can't plan for. Not the problem, but knowing you can handle it. He looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant she'd said something he hadn't expected to agree with, but did. You sound like you've run cattle drives before, he said. I've run enough hard things to know the feeling before them. He leaned back in the chair. For a moment he looked more than she'd ever seen him look, tired. Not physically. That was just weather. Something deeper. The tiredness of a man who'd been carrying a weight alone for so long he'd forgotten it could be put down. When Catherine was sick, he said, the last year, I kept running the ranch exactly as I had before, every day, full operation. He was looking at the table. People thought it was cold. Frank thought I was hiding from it. Maybe I was. He paused. Or maybe I just didn't know what else to do. Both things can be true, she said. He looked up. You can be hiding from something and also not know what else to do, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He held her gaze for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I suppose they're not. She went back to her provisions list. He sat. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was steady, and outside the March wind moved across the Montana dark without any particular malice, just the sound of a world that kept going. After a while, he said, without looking up from where his hands rested on the table, after the drive, when Frank gets back and the summer rotation is set, I'd like to ride the property line with you, north fence to south, the whole thing. She looked up from the list. Why? Because you've been here 6 months and you've made decisions based on what you know about this place. I'd like you to see all of it. He held her gaze. And I'd like to see it with you. She didn't answer immediately. She let the moment be what it was, without rushing past it. All right, she said, after the drive. He nodded. He stayed another 20 minutes, not talking much, and then said goodnight and left. She listened to his footsteps down the hall and the door to his office, and then quiet. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the provisions list. 6 months ago, she'd arrived in a wagon with 2 trunks and a practical arrangement and no particular expectations about what she'd find. She'd found a ranch that had everything money could buy and nothing that money couldn't, and she'd spent 6 months trying to close that gap with schedules and supply orders and kitchen management and small persistent pressure applied in the right places. She hadn't expected this. Whatever this was, this thing building slowly in the evenings over coffee and figures and conversations that kept going somewhere neither of them had planned for them to go. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. She wasn't sure she needed to call it anything. She picked up her pencil and finished the provisions list. The lamp burned steady. The spring wind pressed at the windows and let them hold. Outside, the mountains were still there in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and after 6 months, beginning to feel like something she recognized. Frank Delaney brought the drive home on a Thursday. Evelyn heard them before she saw them. The low sound of horses and men moving across open ground, carrying across the still April air in the particular way that sound carried in flat country, arriving before its source. She was in the kitchen garden at the time, on her knees in the cold dirt, working out the border stakes for the herb section she'd been planning since February. She stood and brushed her hands on her apron and looked toward the north road. They came over the rise in a loose column, Frank at the head, the crew strung out behind him in the relaxed formation of men who'd finished something and were now just riding. She counted them by habit. All of them. Nobody left on the trail. She went inside and told Clara to put the evening meal forward an hour. Nathaniel had ridden out to meet them at the property line. She'd seen him go that morning, knew he'd been watching the north road since yesterday. He came in with Frank an hour after the crew, and she could tell from 20 feet away, from the set of his shoulders and the way he held his hat when he pulled it off, that the news was good. He found her in the kitchen. Miles City paid $4 more per head than the estimate, he said. She looked up from the stove. Per head. Per head. On 180 head. She did the arithmetic in the time it took her to put the spoon down. That's $720 above projection. Yes. Frank must be pleased. Frank is insufferable, Nathaniel said, in the way that Frank is insufferable when he's been right about something. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. A lightness. Not quite humor, but close. He's told me 3 times on the ride home that we should have done this 2 years ago. He's right. I know he's right. I've agreed with him 3 times. He sat down at the kitchen table. He'll be saying it for the next month, probably. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him. Let him. He's earned it. Nathaniel looked at the coffee, then at her. So have you. She went back to the stove. She didn't deflect it, and she didn't make more of it than it was. She just accepted it the way she'd learned to accept things from him, quietly, without requiring it to be larger than it was. The fall drive, she said. Full scale? Full scale. Frank wants 400 head. I told him 350 until we know the Miles City relationship is solid. 350 is right. That's what I thought. He drank the coffee. The herb stakes in the garden. I saw them when I rode in. I started the border layout this morning. I'll have it planted by end of April if the ground stays cooperative. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table, and she recognized the particular quality of his silence, the kind that meant he was working toward something. After supper, he said. The property ride. You said after the drive. I remember. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. Tomorrow, she said. They rode out at 7 in the morning, the 2 of them, with the light still low and the spring grass showing its first real green against the pale soil. Nathaniel rode a gray gelding he'd had for years. She rode a bay mare named Cass that Frank had quietly suggested was the steadiest horse in the string, She suspected Frank had made this suggestion deliberately, which was his version of a generous gesture, and she'd accepted it as such without comment. They went north first, following the fence line, and Nathaniel talked about the land the way he rarely talked about anything, with specificity and feeling, telling her when each section had been acquired, what it had been used for, where the problems were, and why. He pointed out the draw where the water table ran closest to the surface, and they'd thought about a second well. He showed her the spot on the north ridge where the winter winds came from, and why it mattered for how they positioned the cattle before a storm. He talked about his father, who'd started with 300 acres and a single barn, and about the particular decision, a bad year, a good gamble, that had doubled the property and started what it was now. She listened and asked questions and looked at the land with the same attention she gave to ledger figures and kitchen schedules, trying to understand the structure of it, what held it together, and what put pressure on it. At the east fence line, where the ridge dropped off, and you could see the valley floor spread below, he stopped the gray and looked out. "Catherine used to say the view from here was worth every bad winter," he said. She wasn't wrong. No. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't ridden this section in 2 years. I kept telling Frank I needed to, and then not doing it. Why not?" He didn't answer right away. The horses stood still, both of them used to being stopped at views. "Because it was hers in some way," he said. "She loved this ridge. She'd ride up here by herself sometimes just to stand here." He paused. "After she died, I found reasons not to come." Evelyn looked out at the valley. The spring light was the kind that made distances feel shorter than they were. Everything pulled forward and clear. She thought about what it cost a person to come back to the places that belonged to someone gone. She'd had her own versions of that, her mother's kitchen, a chair her father still sat in, specific hours of the day that had belonged to someone who was no longer there to fill them. "Coming back to a place like this doesn't mean you're done with her," she said. "It just means you can hold both things at once, her being gone and the view still being worth it." He turned and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the valley for another moment before she looked back. "I know," he said. "I'm just slower at it than I'd like to be." "That's not a flaw," she said. "That's just how long it takes." They sat there for a while, not talking, with the spring wind moving up the ridge from the valley below, and it was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. They ate lunch out of the saddlebags at the south fence line, cold biscuits and dried meat that Clara had packed without being asked, because Clara had taken one look at the two of them riding out together at 7 in the morning and made her own assessments, which she kept to herself but acted on practically. Evelyn had noticed and appreciated both the discretion and the biscuits. They sat on a downed log near the fence, horses tied to the posts, and ate without much ceremony. "I want to ask you something," Nathaniel said. She waited. "When your contract comes up in October," he looked at the fence line rather than at her. "I'd like you to stay." She'd known this conversation was coming in some form. She'd been aware of it building the way you're aware of weather building, not with specific knowledge, but with the accumulated evidence of air pressure and light quality and the way things had been moving for weeks. "As your housekeeper," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Not only is that." She looked at him. He was still looking at the fence, and she could see the slight tension in his jaw that meant he'd said something he was leaving there, not adding to it, waiting. "Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She saw him register it, a slight stillness. He looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you mean," she said, "and I'm not going to answer you right now because I think you deserve a real answer, and I need a little time to give you one." He held her gaze. "All right. But I want to say something while we're sitting here." "Say it." "I came here to work," she said. "That was the whole of it when I arrived. I wanted independence, and I wanted something that was mine to build, and I didn't want anything that complicated that." She looked out at the south pasture, the long grass beginning to stir in the wind. "I'm still that person. Whatever I decide, I'm still that person." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything else." "I know you're not. That's part of why I'm not saying no right now." She picked up a biscuit and looked at it. "Give me until the end of the month." He nodded. He didn't push and he didn't withdraw. He simply accepted the terms the way he accepted most things that came from her, as information to work with rather than an obstacle. She'd come to count on that in him, the steadiness of it. They finished lunch and rode the west fence line back toward the ranch in the afternoon light, and the conversation they'd had sat between them, not awkwardly but solidly, like something that had been placed on a table and was simply there now, waiting for them to come back to it. Chub. She didn't wait until the end of the month. She took 10 days. In those 10 days, she went about her work, the kitchen, the accounts, the supply rotation for spring, a conversation with Frank about the summer crew expansion, and she thought about the question in the honest way she thought about hard things, which was without rushing toward an answer, but also without avoiding the real questions underneath it. The real question wasn't whether she had feelings for Nathaniel Blackwood. She'd stopped pretending that wasn't true sometime around February, when she'd realized she'd started paying attention to when he came into a room. The real question was what she was willing to risk. She'd built her life on self-sufficiency, not because she was cold or because she didn't want connection, but because she'd learned, at 16 in her mother's kitchen, facing a household that needed running and a father who needed managing and a brother who needed raising, that she could not depend on things staying. People left, situations changed. The only reliable foundation was what you could build and maintain yourself. Coming to Montana had been an extension of that, a better job, a harder challenge, something that was hers. But here was the thing she kept arriving at. In the evenings, after the kitchen was quiet and the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds, she had already changed the terms of her own life by coming here. The self-sufficiency she'd brought with her was intact. It wasn't threatened by what Nathaniel had said on the south fence line. He hadn't asked her to give anything up. He'd asked her to stay. And staying, she realized, was something she'd already decided. She'd decided it sometime in the winter without acknowledging it. In the evenings over coffee and figures, in the mornings watching the kitchen run well, in the moment she'd stood on the south fence line in November and felt the cold wind and thought, with something she hadn't wanted to name, that she wasn't going anywhere. The decision had been made. She'd just been waiting to look at it directly. On the 10th day, she went to his office after supper. He was at his desk. He looked up when she knocked and put his pencil down. She sat in the chair across from him. The same chair she'd sat in the first week, when she'd told him about the supply problems and asked for authority to place orders. She'd sat in this chair many times since then. It had never felt particularly charged before. "I'll stay," she said, "not only as your housekeeper." He was very still. "But I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not giving up the work. The kitchen, the accounts, the way I run things. That stays. It's not a job I'm willing to set aside for any arrangement. If you want a wife who manages the social calendar and leaves the operations to you and Frank, I'm not that." "I know you're not," he said. "And I'll need time," she said, "to do this right. I don't want to rush into something and have it fall apart because we moved before we were ready." "What does that look like?" "It looks like what we've already been doing," she said. "Evenings, conversations, working things out together. Except now we're honest about what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been honest about what it is for a while," he said. "I know. I was catching up." Something crossed his face. That almost smile that she'd learned to wait for because it meant something he actually meant. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She stood, and he stood. And for a moment they were both just standing there in the small office, with the lamp between them and the sound of the ranch settling into evening outside. And she thought about how nothing looked the way she'd expected it to when she'd sat in the wagon coming up the road in October and looked at this place and felt the first thread of doubt and pressed it flat. She was glad she'd pressed it flat. He held out his hand. Not formally, not the way you shook hands at the end of a business meeting, just held it out, palm up, an offering and a question at once. She put her hand in his. Spring moved into summer, and summer settled over Blackwood Ranch in the long golden way of Montana summers, the days enormous and the light lasting until 9 at night, and the work expanding to fill all of it. The herb garden east of the kitchen came in well, sage and thyme, and 2 kinds of mint that Evelyn had not entirely planned for, and that Clara immediately claimed authority over for her cooking. The sage in particular grew with an enthusiasm that surprised her, sprawling past its border stakes by June. She let it. The ranch ran differently that summer. Not in the visible, dramatic way that made for good stories. Nothing so simple as that. It ran differently in the texture of daily life, in the 100 small things that had been slightly wrong and were now slightly better, accumulated into something that felt, finally, like a place that wanted to be lived in. The kitchen staff had become something Evelyn hadn't entirely engineered, but had created the conditions for, a working unit that didn't need her to make every decision. Ruth had learned to cook breakfast, freeing Clara from the 4 o'clock start 3 days a week. Dot had, at some point she refused to specify, decided that she was invested in the operation's success in a way that went beyond her job description, and had taken on the task of tracking the laundry supplies without being asked and presenting Evelyn with a bi-weekly count. Alma had quietly stopped disappearing to town on Thursday afternoons, and when Evelyn asked Clara about this, Clara said simply, "It ran its course, I think," and changed the subject. Frank Delaney remained Frank Delaney. The full-scale fall drive went well, Miles City paying even better than the spring run, and Frank spent approximately 2 weeks in a state of restrained satisfaction that expressed itself primarily as fewer complaints and more detailed daily reports that nobody had asked for. Nathaniel told Evelyn privately that Frank's detailed reports were the closest thing Frank had to joy, and that she should read them carefully because he sometimes buried useful information in them. She read them carefully. He was right. Billy Crane was still at Blackwood Ranch, and by summer he was the one showing new hands the fence procedures, the latch checks, the 100 small habitual competencies that separated a man who knew what he was doing from a man who was guessing. He still made mistakes. Everyone did. But he made them like a man who understood they were part of learning rather than evidence of failure, which was a different relationship with error than the one he'd come in with. One morning in July, she saw him in the yard, teaching a boy of about 18 how to check the tension on a fence wire, patient and specific in the way she'd once been with him over a cup of coffee and leftover cornbread. She watched from the kitchen window for a moment and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Some things you set in motion, and then they become their own. In August, a man came to Blackwood Ranch. He arrived on a Tuesday with a good horse and a city coat that hadn't been broken in for the territory, and he introduced himself to Nathaniel as Warren Elias, a cattleman from Illinois looking to expand his operations westward. He was well-spoken, genuinely knowledgeable about cattle, and by noon he was sitting in Nathaniel's office with ledgers spread between them. Evelyn brought coffee and listened for the 3 minutes she was in the room. She learned in those 3 minutes that Elias was looking for an experienced operation he could study and potentially partner with, that he had significant capital, and that he had heard about Blackwood Ranch from a man in Miles City who'd been impressed by the quality of the fall delivery. She went back to the kitchen and thought about it while she worked. That evening, she told Nathaniel what she'd observed. "He's not here to partner," she said. "He's here to see if he can acquire." Nathaniel looked at her. "That's a significant conclusion from 3 minutes." He kept asking about the ownership structure, partners, investors, heirs. She set down the cup she'd been drying. A man who wants to partner asks about operations and people. A man who wants to buy asks about structure. He was quiet. She could see him reviewing the day's conversation against her framework. "He asked about my family situation," Nathaniel said slowly. "Yes." I thought he was making conversation. He was gathering information. Nathaniel sat back. He wasn't angry. He was the kind of man who didn't waste energy on anger at himself, only at fixable problems. "What do you think I should do?" "Talk to him again tomorrow. Ask him directly what he's interested in. He'll either tell you or he'll dance around it, and either way, you'll know where you stand. And if he wants to buy, then you decide if you want to sell." She looked at him. "Do you?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Then you tell him that clearly and you let him leave. He may come back with a partnership offer that's actually genuine. That's worth hearing if it comes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You worked all of that out in 3 minutes." "I've been reading people in confined spaces my whole adult life," she said. "A boarding house is a very good training ground for that." Elias came back to the office the next morning, and Nathaniel asked him directly. To his credit, Elias answered directly. He wanted to acquire, and he was prepared to offer a significant price. Nathaniel told him clearly that the ranch was not for sale. Elias stayed for lunch. He had manners, whatever his motives, and left by mid-afternoon. 2 months later, he sent a letter proposing a joint venture arrangement for supplying Miles City, structured in a way that made genuine sense and cost Nathaniel nothing in ownership. Nathaniel brought the letter to Evelyn. They read it together and talked through the terms for an hour, and in the end, he wrote back accepting with 2 modifications she'd suggested. It was not the last time she sat across from him and helped him work through something that had nothing formally to do with the kitchen or the household accounts. It became, without either of them declaring it, simply part of how the ranch was run. The ceremony, when they finally had it, was small and without much fuss, because neither of them was the kind of person who needed much fuss. It was October, a year, almost exactly, from the day she'd arrived on the wagon with 2 trunks and Court's 4 words of conversation. Clara made a cake that leaned slightly to one side and tasted remarkable. Frank showed up in a clean shirt, which she understood to be the maximum gesture of which he was capable, and she appreciated it accordingly. Billy Crane stood in the back of the small gathering with his hat in his hands and a grin that he kept trying to make more solemn than it wanted to be. Margaret Coles from the Granger dry goods store came, which surprised Evelyn. She hadn't known Nathaniel had invited her. "I like to see how things turn out," Margaret said, when Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I told you that first fall you'd be here a long time. You said I didn't seem like the lonely type." "Same thing." Margaret looked around the yard at the gathered crew and the kitchen staff and the ranch spread out behind them in the October light. "You've changed this place." "It's changed me too," Evelyn said. She meant it. That was the part she hadn't expected and couldn't have planned for, that a place could do that she could come in intending to fix things and find, somewhere in the work, that she was being worked on in return. Her sister Margaret, the other Margaret, in Columbus, had sent a letter she'd received 2 weeks before, full of questions and exclamations and the slightly breathless tone she got when life moved faster than she could follow. "Evie, are you sure? I mean truly sure. Not just sure because you've decided and you don't go back on decisions. Really sure." Evelyn had written back, "Maggie, I am really sure. Not because I don't go back on decisions, though that's also true. Because I came here to build something and I have. Because the work is real and the place is real and the person I'm building it with is real in all the ways that matter. I was afraid for a long time of needing something I couldn't control. I still am, a little. But I've decided the fear is smaller than the thing I'd miss if I let it make my choices. That's as sure as I know how to be." She thought about that letter, standing in the October yard with Margaret Coles on one side and Frank Delaney shifting his weight on the other and the whole of Blackwood Ranch visible in every direction. The barns and corrals and the south pasture and the mountains beyond, the kitchen garden with its overgrown sage, the porch she'd walked across 100 times in the dark, the barn whose door she'd held against the wind on her 3rd night here, while a man who didn't know her yet came around the corner to help. Nathaniel found her there, standing and looking at it all. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. He was in his good coat, the one he wore to town, and he'd combed his hair and there was still a small cut on the back of his hand from a fence repair the previous week that hadn't been cleaned properly. She'd told him about it twice. He'd said it was fine both times. She reached into her pocket and took out the small kit she still carried. "Give me your hand first," she said. He looked at her, then he held out his hand. She cleaned the cut and applied the salve and wrapped it neatly, the way she'd been doing for a year, and when she was done, she held his hand for a moment longer than the task required. "Now I'm ready," she said. He looked at her with an expression she'd been watching develop for a year and still found she couldn't fully describe. It was something that happened when all the defended parts of a person finally stopped being necessary. She'd seen it in the kitchen in December, just the edge of it. She saw all of it now. "You're going to keep telling me what I'm doing wrong," he said. "Someone has to. Frank does it too. Frank tells you what's wrong with the cattle. I tell you everything else." She let go of his hand. "You need both." "I know," he said. "I've known that for a while." She thought, looking at him, about what she'd learned in a year of this particular work. Not just the kitchen management and the supply chains and the staff schedules, but the harder, less reducible things. That competence was a foundation, but not a whole life. That independence and connection were not the opposites she'd always kept them as. That some things had to be built slowly, without certainty, from the inside out. And the uncertainty was not a sign the foundation was wrong, but only that you couldn't see the whole shape of it yet. That you could be a person who didn't need saving and still reach out your hand in the cold dark when something needed holding. That the strongest structures she'd ever known had been built by people who understood both how to stand alone and when to stop standing alone. The distinction mattered. The timing of it mattered more. Around them, the ranch waited. The crew gathered, the October light going golden across the grass, the mountains the same impassive blue they'd been the day she arrived. She put her hand through his arm, and they walked toward the gathered people who had become, without any formal announcement or ceremony of their own, the closest thing she'd had to a community since she'd left Ohio at 23, with a practical mind and a long list, and no clear idea yet of what she was building toward. She knew now. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the land, it wasn't even the work itself, though the work was real and she'd never stopped needing it. It was this: a kitchen that ran well, and a garden that grew past its borders, and a man who had learned to leave a door open instead of just managing around the empty space behind it. It was a girl named Ruth who could make breakfast now. It was Billy Crane's grin in the back of the crowd. It was the south fence line in spring light and a conversation left on a table that they'd both come back to. It was what happened when two people who were very good at surviving on their own finally, carefully, chose not to. That was the thing worth building. That was what lasted.